Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all safe and healthy and have been utilizing your precious time very fruitfully during the lockdown. I am Sanchi Arora. I'm working as a senior project scientist at IIT Delhi, and I've been associated with Think India for the last 5 years. We, Team Think India, have been ensuring since the beginning of the lockdown to create ample opportunities to enrich everyone's knowledge database. And with the same intent, we have gathered again today to celebrate the launch of our beloved Amish Tripathi ji's latest book, Legend of Suhail Dev, The King Who Saved India. Amish ji is a diplomat, author, and a columnist, and he has written 7 books till date, whose 5 million copies have been sold. The books have been translated into 10 Indian and 9 international languages. His Shiva trilogy is the fastest selling book series in Indian publishing history, and his Ramchandra series being the second fastest one. He's currently serving as the director of the Nehru Center in London. Amishji has been decorated with several prestigious recognitions, like being listed among 50 most powerful Indians by India Today magazine in 2019, by Forbes magazine as among 100 most influential celebrities of India continuously from 2012 to 2018. Not just this, Amish Ji is a distinguished alumnus of IIM Calcutta. He is a voracious reader, a music enthusiast, and an active sports person. He's deeply committed to environment preservation as well. I genuinely feel privileged to have the opportunity to interact with you today, sir. Welcome, Amish, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Shanchi.
Thank you, sir. Now, to make this evening even more interesting, we have with us another gifted author, Ms. Sai Swarupa Ayerji. Sai Swarupa ji is an IITian and an investment professional turned satisfied author of 5 novels. She is also a Carnatic classical singer. I extend a very warm welcome to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Sanchi. Pleasure to have this conversation with you, Amish ji. Congratulations upon the new book, The Legend of Suhail Dev. Suhail Dev has become a bestseller, not just in its category of historical fiction, but in overall books category in India, probably abroad. So history has become, from being a very boring and burdensome subject in school to the most, best-selling, category in books. So what was so diagonally wrong about the way the curriculum taught us history, and how is Suhail Dev changing that?
First of all, if I can say, Sai, it is not often that I get interviewed by an author who I am a fan of. I loved your Abhaya, and for all of you who have not read Sai's books, please do read it. She writes beautifully, and she brings across, our ancient women characters so well. And it's so critical in our way. One of the things that's a problem in the modern day is we don't have enough archetypes and heroines of our own. When we have to speak of women's rights movement, they keep putting American examples and British examples. Most Indians will say, "Boss Marusu, what does it have to do with me?" And I think Sai is doing wonderful work in this. So to all of you who've not read her books, I would strongly encourage you. Please check it out.
Thank you so much.
She writes wonderfully. She has a rare skill of having knowledge and the ability to communicate it well.
Oh my God! It's like all my dreams are coming true. You've been a hero since long, Amish ji.
Now, on subjects being made boring, I think that's a problem with our education system itself. The education system that we have in India today was essentially brought in by the British when they destroyed our own education system. There's this wonderful book by Dharampal ji called The Beautiful Tree. I'm sure many of you would have read it. Those of you who haven't, please check it out. It's available for free on the internet. It's out of copyright. Dharampal ji spoke of what our education system was like before the British invasion and before the British, destroyed it with their taxation policies. The system that the British set up, the education system, is largely modeled on the Prussian education system of that time. Prussia was the pre-modern name for Germany, right? And Prussia was, for much of human history, not very educated or literate, unlike India. India was, a vast majority of us were actually educated through most of human history because our schools were very widespread. Prussia wanted to raise its education levels within one generation. So their system was a very high teacher-student ratio, standard syllabus, exactly what we follow today, which, if you think about it, made sense. If you didn't want to raise every individual quality a lot, you just wanted to quickly educate people so that you can have a generation of clerks, right? That is the education system the British put into India. And yes, when the British were ruling India, we had no choice. But we've been free for 170 years. I see no, the fault is ours now. We can't keep blaming the British forever. Who stopped us from reforming our education system? And our education system remains what it was during the British times. And one of the features of this education system is it kills all interest in every subject, okay? Not just history. I'm a lover of mathematics, for example. My family, my grandfather was a maths teacher. He was a Pandit in Kashi, Vishwanath Ji. Besides that, he was a maths and physics teacher. Our family is obsessed with mathematics. My father is an MTech. I graduated in mathematics. We think it's one of the most beautiful subjects ever. But the way it's taught to us in school and college, it kills all your interest. It's the same with history as well. History textbooks are written in a way to be a cure for insomnia, just make you fall asleep. If it was boring, it won't be a problem. There's another massive problem with it as well. And scholars like Sanjeev Sanyal, Vikram Sampath, they've spoken well on this. I mean, they're scholars. I'm only a storyteller. But if you hear their words, one of the biggest problems is not that it's boring. One of the biggest problems is that the history that is taught to us is often not our history. It is the history of our invaders, right? So we spend more time studying those who invaded and destroyed much of India rather than our own people who resisted, right? And corollary to this is the excessive Delhi centricity, in our history books. And corollary to this, you will be shocked to find that many of the people who have written our seminal history books, whose books we study in school, who we are told are the greatest scholars in India, don't know a word of Sanskrit. Okay, so it's as bizarre as someone writing the French history books, seminal French history books, without knowing a word of French. The French won't accept it. What can you understand of Indian history when you don't know a word of Sanskrit? Or a word of our own languages, classical Tamil or Marathi or Bengali. And the only language, the people who've written our history books, the language that they are good in is English. And they speak English. I've come to the UK and I've realized that those Indians who've written our history books, they speak English even better than the British do. Okay. So they are more British than the British are. Okay. So obviously, as a result of this, our history books have very little connection with our own roots. There's excessive Delhi centricity. I admit Delhi is important, but it's not the only part of India. No, there are other parts also which have been ignored completely, and excessive focus on our invaders. So we Indians get a sense that we are a loser civilization, which lost every battle for the last 1,000 years. That we are told that we were cowards and we are non-violent. Mahatma Gandhi's very noble message is projected backwards. When the reality is, if you read actual history, we are actually the toughest buggers around. Okay? We are the only Bronze Age culture which is alive till today. We are the only one. Every other Bronze Age culture has been wiped out. Every single China is not a Bronze Age culture. China started just 2,500 years ago. Emperor Qin was 2,500. We're a Bronze Age culture. I'm a Shaivite. I would chant the Sri Rudram to this day, which goes back 7,000, 10,000 years, at least, at the minimum. Vaishnavas would be chanting Purushottam, which goes back to the Rig Veda, right? We are a continuous pre-Bronze Age civilization, the only ones alive till today. We are alive because our ancestors fought. Our resistance was fierce. Yes, we lost battles, but we won many battles as well. That is why we are still alive. Zoroastrian Persia, one of the greatest empires of its time, was wiped out in just 30 to 50 years. That is it, when the Arabs attacked. They surrendered, they were wiped out, their temples, fire temples were destroyed, all their universities were burned to the ground, their greatest cities were burned to the ground, and the only remnants of that great civilization survive in India, the Parsis, because India gave them refuge. लेकिन 1500-2000 साल हो गए, अभी तक साला हम खड़े हैं. We are still standing. We still chant our ancient chants. We still go to our temples. It's because our ancestors were exceptionally brave. They never, our resistance was fierce. We need to learn this because that will give us pride, right? But what we learn is a very defeatist, attitude that we were castes, we were, I'm not denying some of our weaknesses. I'm not denying that. But that's not the only story. There is another story as well, which is not taught to us.
Thank you for the very insightful explanation of that. And I think a great point on us being told that us being told the defeatist version of history, and we're just made to believe that 1192 May Ghori attacked, he killed Prithviraj Chauhan, and the story over for India.
Yeah, boss, so the key question we have to ask: if we lost every battle, how come we are still alive, boss?
Exactly.
How come we are still alive? Are you saying the invaders who went around the entire world massacring every classical civilization, not one has been left alive, were suddenly very kind in India? They let us live. No, boss, they were as ruthless out here. But we didn't surrender. We kept fighting. We kept fighting.
On that note, I always keep wondering because, the Hindus were divided. That's why they fell that was the belief. But was that dividedness our strength instead of weakness? Because the enemy could never consolidate, right? There were continuous struggles in different areas. Assam struggled. Assam put up a stiff resistance. South put up a stiff resistance. Some kingdoms fell. The new kingdoms rose. Like Kakatiyas fell. And the Reddis and Kapanayaka and Madurai Sultanate, Madurai Pandya, they rose to power back. So there was a phase of continuous resistance. Actually, the Islamist, whatever they call as Delhi Sultanate, they never got to consolidate India as a whole, right? But then we are taught that we just got defeated in 1192.
Sai, one of the things our ancestors told us is the very thing that is your strength can also be your weakness, right? So, one of the lines that comes to us from our scriptures is Ati Sarvatra Varjait, that excess of anything, extremes of anything should be avoided. Divinity is in balance, right? You're right. The fact that India didn't have one head to cut off, that many people are IT people out here, you realize the value of a backup. Right? So if pharaonic Egyptian culture had to be destroyed, if we destroyed Thebes, and if you destroyed what became Alexandria, Egyptian culture was gone. The Roman culture, which was so widespread, if you sacked and destroyed or took over Rome, and if you sacked and destroyed and took over Constantinople, which became Istanbul, that's it, Roman Empire is finished. Same with Mesopotamia, Central, all of them. They had one head. If you destroyed that one head, everything collapsed. India, there was no one head to cut off, right? Because we were so dispersed, but we were still strung together. So our unity was not that every flower has to convert into a rose. Our unity was a rose is also okay, sunflower is also okay, champa is also okay, mogra is also okay, various different flowers, but there is a string which unites all of us. That string is the soil of Mother India, right? You find this description repeatedly in all our texts. I use it in my books. It's there in the Vishnu Puran, Uttaram Yat Samudrasya Himadrasya Dakshanam Varsham Tadabharatam Nama Bharti Yatra Santatihi. That north of the ocean and south of the Himalaya lies the noble nation of Bharat, and there live the descendants of Bharat. Okay, so the string that united all of us together was deep attachment to the Indian subcontinent. this land is our land, this land is holy land, and whoever has the soil of Mother India in his genes is one of us. That was our ancestors' approach. This was the string which united the garland of India together. So you could pluck out one flower, but the string was still there, right? And other flowers were there, and those other flowers would fight while the flower which you plucked would recover and come back, right? So there was no one head to cut off. This was our strength. The fact that we were in some ways so diverse. But there is a weakness to this as well, that our diversity gave us our strength, no doubt. But our diversity also meant that often we couldn't pull a united front together. We had no shortage of bravery. You know, the nonsense that they tell us that Indians were weak and cowards, all bullshit. We had among the bravest warriors, right? But often we were fighting each other rather than fighting a common enemy. Sadly, that's something you see, let's be honest, today as well. Right? And it's one of the things I put in the forward of Suhail Dev, of Legend of Suhail Dev, that the biggest task our leaders have always had is to somehow unite us. Okay, that is the biggest task that they have had. Once we are united, we are undefeatable. Okay. The problem is to unite us. Okay, and because unfortunately for our country, our default state is infighting. Okay. You know, and we'll find some of the other excuse: language, caste, religion, regions. We'll find some of the other excuse, and we'll start fighting. So I've said this often: enemies didn't need to defeat us; we defeated ourselves. Very often, you'll find so many battles, so many critical battles we've lost, not because the enemy was superior, because we defeated ourselves. The Pandyas and Cholas lost to Malik Kafur because of infighting. Let's be honest. The Kakadiyas lost to Malik Kafur because of infighting. Gurjar Pratiharas lost because of infighting. Marathas lost the third battle of Panipat because of infighting. There was no reason they should have lost. They had a better army, right? But they lost because of infighting. So this is something that we have to, Hindi में बोलते हैं ना, गांठ बांध लेनी चाहिए. We have to really kind of sear it into our consciousness. We fight each other, we will lose, and we have done that repeatedly. Fortunately, we've never lost so completely that we've been wiped out. When we see the enemy at our gates, somehow we unite. Like I can sense right now, I can sense it in India today, we are united again. I'm a diplomat, so I can't say the name of the country which is attacking us. We all know which that country is, and सालों को सबक सिखाना पड़ेगा. But I mean, I'm a diplomat, so I will not take the name of the country. But I can sense that today we are united, right? At least most of us are, which means we will prevail, right? This is our biggest problem, which is why I find the story of King Suhail Dev so inspiring. He united us.
Inspiring. And thing about very striking feature of Suhail Dev is about his humble origins.
About the?
About his origins from a subaltern community. And we are told that Hinduism is a Brahmanical concept. Right? So, but starting from Suhail Dev and probably before Suhail Dev itself, most of our heroes who defended Hinduism, who united people, most of them belong to the subaltern communities. Right? And why does that misunderstanding about some Brahmanical hegemony or something like that still prevail, where so many heroes belong to actual masses?
A few things. You are right that yes, I mean, King Suhail Dev was subaltern, and most of India's truly powerful dynasties were actually not born quote unquote upper caste. The Mauryas were not born upper caste. Neither were the Guptas, neither were the Marathas.
Yes.
So, and the most powerful dynasties that we had. And even the term Brahminical patriarchy that is used often, what does it translate at? Essentially the rule of a Brahmin male, right? That's what Brahminical patriarchy translates as. The most powerful Brahmin male ruler in human history was actually Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, right? Before him, the only Brahmin ruler who controlled a reasonable portion of India under his own name was Pushyamitra Shunga, who compared to other dynasties was actually quite minor. And the most powerful Brahmin male ruler before that was Ravan. So if you go through our history, Brahminical patriarchy, matlab Brahmin male ruler controlling most of India, 3 people, 3 men, that's it. So the term doesn't really make that much sense. And I didn't used to understand it earlier. I've come to the UK and I've realized that actually what happens is our establishment intelligentsia did not create their own theories to explain India, right? I don't know if it's because they hadn't read enough, didn't have the capability, or they didn't understand India enough. There are no main theories to explain India. All that they did was took Western theories and replaced Western terms with Indian terms. That's all that they. I understand that now when I'm living in the UK and understanding Western theories. So Western, there's a Western theory of white patriarchy, right? Essentially the rule of white men, which makes sense to some extent, to some extent. And I'm not saying I agree with all parts of those theories, because there was colonial rule for much of the world where white men did rule much of the known world for 300, 400 years. So now our establishment intelligentsia wanted to convert that to an Indian theory. So an obvious translation of that is white patriarchy to Hindu patriarchy. But they realized that vast majority of Hindus are actually backward castes and scheduled tribes. So they can't attack them. So then they made it Brahminical patriarchy, which, like I said, makes no sense in India because we've had only 3, powerful Brahmin males. And the Peshwas didn't rule in their name. And directly they ruled only parts of Maharashtra, let's be honest. There were the Gaikwads, Shindes, Scindias, Hodkars, and they all ruled in the name of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's dynasty. So Peshwas were not really as powerful as they are made out to be. Pushyamitra Shunga was powerful, Ravan was powerful, and of course, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was powerful. So this Brahminical patriarchy makes no sense because you have only 3 examples. And of those 3 examples, 2 are heroes to the establishment intelligentsia, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and Ravan. So the entire theory actually makes no sense. And the only way you understand it is if you realize they actually haven't built any theory of their own. Again, maybe they didn't have the capability or they didn't understand India enough. They've just taken a Western theory and replaced terms, which is why most of us in the real India, these theories make no sense. Having said that, it does not mean that caste discrimination did not happen. Let's accept that. It did happen, right? And there are things on which India has to make improvements, right? But one of the things which fills me with pride as an Indian is that our founding fathers accepted that caste discrimination did happen. And India has rolled out in the last 70 years the largest positive discrimination, the largest affirmative action program in the history of humanity. Okay, no country has done as much, and despite being a poor country, okay, the US does not do as much for African Americans. Europe does not do as much for Romas or their or their blacks out here. And they're not strictly comparable. I'm saying these examples, but I'm just giving it as an example. But in India, we have rolled out the largest positive discrimination program in the history of humanity for Indian backward castes, Indian scheduled castes, and Indian scheduled tribes. Which means, yes, discrimination happened, but India has done a huge amount to make up for that, right? Which we need to speak of. We still have a long way to go, I'm not denying that, but we have made massive improvements. And outside of these liberal democracies, how minorities are treated, we know exactly what happens. Millions are put in concentration camps. Women are forcibly sterilized. It is happening in our neighboring countries. We know exactly what happens, right? So I'm not saying that discrimination did not happen, but we must acknowledge that India has done a huge amount, right? We have to do more. I'm not denying that. We have to do more. And in history, most of our powerful dynasties have actually been subaltern, have not been upper caste. And Brahminical patriarchy makes no sense because there have been only 3 men you can think of, 2 of whom are heroes for the establishment intelligentsia. So the entire theory is a little warped.
Talking about the oppression, in Suhail Dev, there's a great explanation about Turkic violence and oppression and the way they.
Sorry, Sai, your voice is cracking up. Sorry. Huh.
So, in Suhail, how's it now?
Yeah.
In Suhail Dev, a great deal of attention has been given to the way the Turkic invaders destroyed civilizations in their way, and there's a lot of difference between them and the Indian Muslims. So, what exactly caused this kind of monstrosity in those, that nobility and that royalty of those regions? And unfortunately, we see it happening even today in these regions, right? So, what differentiates Indian civilization from taking that path, and most importantly, what can be done so that globally we can stop such monstrosity from spreading?
No, there is, and this has to be discussed, there is an arc of history over the last 2000 years. Largely 3 communities, Europeans, Arabs, and Turks, across the world, massacred hundreds of millions of people simply because they worshipped the wrong gods, or they worshipped goddesses, because goddess worship was apparently a crime, or that they were nature worshipping or idol worshipping. It didn't just happen in India, it happened all over the world. Thousands of temples were destroyed and burned to the ground. Again, you don't just see this in India. You go to Greece, you see it on their idols out there. You go to Rome, you see it out there. You go to you go to Egypt. Why is the nose of the Sphinx in Egypt? Why is it broken? Because there was an Arab commander who is Arab or Turk, I'm not sure, who put a cannon to try and blow out the Sphinx, try and blow up the Sphinx. I kid you not. So this happened all over the world. And this needs to be spoken of, because there has to be coming to terms with this across the world. It is brutal beyond measure. And like I said, largely 3 communities, Europeans, Arabs, and Turks. So the difference between India and other parts of the world is that India did not get wiped out, right? Our culture. Which means that the historical pain is still there. Okay? You know what happens in a computer, right? If you wipe out the ROM and the RAM, the computer forgets what it was. You just install a new software, so it starts from scratch. It has happened to many cultures across the world. They've forgotten who they were, right? What their ancestors were. So, for example, I went to Parthenon, which is in Italy. I'm an idol worshipper, right? A Murti Pujak. That's the term they use for us, idol worshipper. I felt pain when going to Parthenon, because it was a Roman temple where all the idols have been destroyed and now it has been taken over as a church. But the Italians whose heritage it is, they go out there, they don't feel any pain because the memory has been reset, right? Like what happens to a computer, right? RAM, ROM has been wiped out, there's a new software. It's all the previous memories have been wiped out. How do we come to make peace with this, right? Denying the truth of it will not help us. Denying the truth of it will not help us. They are so sorry, someone's trying to call. Sorry. Denying the truth of it will not help us, as has been attempted over the last 70, 80 years, where we are told that no, Mahmud Ghazali didn't do anything. He was actually writing beautiful, ghazals, and what they try and tell us, right? Or that no, Alauddin Khilji was actually a very good man. Aurangzeb was playing the sitar. These kind of nonsense will obviously not help. We have to accept the brutality of what happened, speak the truth of that. But we also, as Gautam Buddha had said so rightly, that holding hate in your heart for someone else is the equivalent of holding a burning coal in your hand in the hope that you will, find the person you hate and throw it on that guy. But in the meantime, you're getting burned. How can we behave like Lord Shiva, where there is poison in society? We pull it out, right? So that it doesn't poison society anymore. But we don't swallow it so that it destroys us. And the way I see it, those of us who are genuine believers of the Mahadev, and like the Mahadev, love this holy land of India, have to work at pulling this poison out. Which means speak the truth of what happened, but realize that it has nothing to do with people today. Okay? Because if we are going to aid the cause of hatred and fighting today, okay, and infighting today, then our neighboring country, we know exactly which that country is. What will happen to our own country? Right? So how do we find that balance? Where we can speak the truth of it, pull the poison out, but find equanimity. So sorry, yaar, just sorry, guys. Bar mujhe, next time he comes, I'll just pick up on my phone and I tell them I'm on another interview. Sorry. But for me, that is a very, very critical part of what I hope to do. And I'm trying to do it in my own small way. One of the things I say in the book, it's a thing at the beginning, that my primary identity is that I'm a son of Mother India. That's my primary identity. For me, I believe my primary identity is that of I'm a child of Mother India. And one of the statements I make in the book, as long as there are enough people who realize across all religions, across all communities, across all languages, as long as there are enough people who realize that this is our most important identity, India is safe. And for me, that is most critical. So on either extreme, where there are the left-wing extreme, which says that no, nothing happened. There were no brutal invasions. They were all wonderful people, the Turks. That is nonsense, because we can see the evidence of all. We should speak the truth of what happened. But if you swing to the other extreme, that we should indulge in endless civil war now for what happened a few centuries later, think of what will happen to Mother India. Okay, and do we want to hurt our own mother? To me, that is the critical conversation. We must be united.
Today's India, especially the
Sorry?
younger generation, of today's India, going forward on that note. they experience this contradicting situation, given there is a career priority, career and academic detail that takes up, that is the top priority. And there is their social and professional identity. And then there is a legacy of our ancestors, as you said, 7,000, 10,000-year-old legacy. And then there is a philosophy that has been passed on to us, which we tend to believe is something, there is something, a purpose beyond this body, beyond this, the bounds of this material world. So how can, what is your advice to youth in blending these contradicting forces and going to 20%?
One of the things I always say, what we have to learn from our ancestors primarily is the attitude. We have to learn our knowledge, of course. There's a lot of nonsense that the British Raj told us, and sadly our own elite have carried on that nonsense, that ancient Indians didn't used to write, or we never had a sense of India and the British created it. This is all nonsense. Okay, there's enough textual evidence to show that ancient Indians did have a sense. I just quoted from the Vishnu Purana. Ancient Indians did have a sense of our motherland and of India. Culturally, we were united. Ancient Indians did write. The National Mission of Manuscript has tabulated over 3 million Sanskrit handwritten manuscripts. That's more than the rest of the ancient world combined. Right? So we used to write copious amounts, and this despite so many of our manuscripts being destroyed when Nalanda was destroyed, Nalanda University by Bakhtiyar Khilji, or when Takshashila was destroyed, or when Vikramshila was destroyed, or Ujjaini was destroyed, or Mahodayapuram was destroyed. We lost so many manuscripts. Despite that, there are 3 million Sanskrit handwritten manuscripts, more than the rest of the ancient world combined. There's a lot of knowledge we can study as well. And not all of these are spiritual texts. They are scientific, mathematics, navigation, astronomy. Our ancestors were really kick-ass. They were in a different league, right? They weren't just successful economically, but militarily, academically, intellectually, soft power-wise, in every way. But I think the key thing we have to learn from our ancestors is the attitude, right? That we were like the America of the ancient world. We were open to knowledge from anywhere. We sometimes imported dynasties also from abroad. Okay, like the Varmans imported someone from Cambodia. We were just obsessed with merit. We gave refuge to the Jews, we gave refuge to the Parsis, as long as they respected our way of life. We gave people refuge, right? We were lovers of knowledge because our ancestors believed that, boss, Saraswati Ma can bless anyone. Why will she bless only an Indian? She can bless anyone. And if she has blessed someone, learn from that person. It's in your own selfish interest. And if you're learning from someone, then treat that person respectfully, right? So our ancestors had this attitude, like one of the rishis, of the Sankhya philosophy is Kapila Muni. I'm sure you've heard of him. One of the interpretations of the word Kapila is golden hair, okay? Blonde. Okay, could it be that he was? I don't know. Okay, could it be that he was from abroad, and no one cared because he was knowledgeable? Learn from him, right? This nonsense that we had of fair skin, dark skin. This is a recent phenomenon. One person at a lit fest told me, no, Indians were always obsessed with fair skin. I said, how? Quote me something from our text. He said, no, there's that bhajan. I said, what bhajan? He said, no, Yashoda Maiya se bole Nand Lala, Radha kyun gori, main kyun kala. So I said, boss, that's from a Raj Kapoor movie. It's not from our ancient text. What is wrong with you? Okay, our ancient text did not differentiate between the color of the skin. I mean, Draupadi ji was considered one of the most beautiful women ever. But one of her names was Krishna. The very word Krishna means dark skin, right? We are told in that nonsensical Aryan invasion theory, that Lord Ram and Lord Krishna were Aryan gods and Lord Shiva was a Dravidian god. Okay, but Lord Ram was dark-skinned. Lord Krishna was dark-skinned. Again, the very word means dark-skinned. But Lord Shiva was fair-skinned. Okay. I think Sai Swarupa has dropped off. I'm sure she'll come back. Achha, okay. Lord Shiva was fair-skinned. Karpura Gauram, it means fair-skinned like camphor. So there was no differentiation in the color of the skin. You don't find that in our ancient texts at all. So what I encourage the youth to follow most is the attitude of our ancestors. They were truly merit-driven. They didn't care about the color of your skin. For example, Maharishi Satyakam Javali, the originator of the Javali Upanishad, who was the Raj Purohit of the Ayodhya royal family during Lord Ram's time, very senior role. He was the son of a single Shudra mother. He didn't even know who his father was. And nobody cared because he was so brilliant. People respected him, Satyakam Javali, Maharishi Satyakam Javali. So that was the attitude of our ancestors. We didn't look at the color of the skin. We didn't look at the gender. We didn't look whether the person was Indian or non-Indian. We looked at the content of the character and the talent and ability of the person. That attitude we must imbibe. If we can imbibe that attitude, we will recreate the massively successful and powerful India that we were during the time of our ancestors. During most of the first millennium common era, India was by far the most successful country in the world. Our ancestors, they created that largely with this attitude of being open to merit and to character, rather than the color of the skin or your background or your birth or which nation you're from. That attitude we must imbibe. That's my thought. And Sai, if you're still there, I guess we'll go on to the next question.
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you. I can see you. So
okay, cool. Please, then your next question.
Okay. So this will be my last question before I open the ground to Sanji, Pradeep, Om, and Vishak. Sohail Dev is written by you along with another author from Immortal Writers Center. So please share more about the Writers Center and how the research takes place.
How it works, okay. So,
because Amishji, Think India also nurtures a lot of writers, and there are a lot of mentorship programs sponsored by Think India. So I
awesome.
thought this would add value to a lot of inspiring writers out there.
Awesome. I've said this often. One of my biggest problems, one of my biggest fears in life is that I have too many story ideas for one lifetime. Lord Shiva has already blessed me with more ideas than the capacity to write, because it takes me 1.5 to 2 years between books. My books are long, they're detailed, there's a lot of research. I can't write quicker. There are 1.5 to 2 years between books. I have between 20 to 25 series ideas in my mind already. Not books, series. Okay, like Shiva Trilogy is one series. So I'm only done with 1.5 series till now, and I have 20 to 25 series ideas. And I can't carry my stories into my cremation pyre. I will enter my next life a deeply unhappy soul. So this was an idea from my team that how can we get my stories out. One of the best ways to do that is to set up a writer center, right? So that we can expand my capacity. So this is an idea that has been tried in the West, but it has never been tried in India before. Idea is very simple. We've hired 4 writers already, it's authors like Wilbur Smith, James Patterson, etc. have done these writer center in the West, but their model is a little different. I'm a bit of a control freak, so my model is a little different. So I write the story summary, which is the broad arc of the story, the key characters, etc. Anywhere between 5,000 to 10,000 words. Then either a team or an individual writer works on the first draft, which could be 65,000 words, maybe 70,000 words. Okay. And then I work on it and make the second draft and the final manuscript. So for you as a reader, it will read like one of my books. We didn't want to mislead the readers that it is unlike all other books which are solely my authorship. We wanted to make it clear that this is that there's a team effort. It's not just my work. So we make it, if there are a few authors who work, then we make it Immortal Writers Center. If there's just one individual writer, then we'll put that individual writer's name out here so that it's clear. The individual writers, they get a fixed they get their fixed amount regardless of the fate of the book. Sometimes it has happened that a manuscript has got written and I'm not happy with it, so I might just junk the project. Then it's my problem. It's not the writer's problem. The writer will get his or her money. It's a fixed amount. So, and with the story summary, I also tell them what research they should do, what all they should read, etc. So this is how the process works. I'm not saying it's ideal. This has never been tried before in India. So we are kind of discovering how to make it work. And
it's very innovative because a lot of people have this history as their passion, subject of passion. So making it into a career is something.
Thank you. So I'd love to engage with, I'll put my team in touch with, with the Indic Book Club as well, and we'll see, because they were thinking of running a contest, because right now we have just published authors, but we want to bring in more. But initially we have these projects running, so we wanted to bring it in phases because there is a bandwidth issue as well. But we want to bring in more writers over the next 6 months to a year. So we'll either approach some more published writers, or we could run a contest, a short story contest, and get in fresh guys. So my team has been evaluating this, and I'd love for them to engage with the Indic Book Club as well. And over time, hopefully, these writers will get a fixed amount. Their names will be there on the cover of the book as well. I'm hoping they'll write their own books as well, and we'll have more writers rooted in India and saying Mother India's, telling Mother India's culture to not just Indians but abroad as well.
Thank you so much. So, with your permission, Amishji, I add 2 lines about Indic Book Club. We have already conducted a short story competition, based on Kurukshetra, the lesser known battles of Kurukshetra. So 10 writers have been selected, 10 stories have been selected, and the anthology will come out soon.
Wow. Okay. Very good.
So I just hope.
When is it coming out? I'd love to buy that book.
Maybe I think August. We'll definitely keep in touch with you. And thank you for allowing me this line. All the 10 writers, they come from for most of them, it is the first time writing experience. They come from different walks of life, and they are all united by passion for Mahabharata, and they are writing a text, various versions of the text, and come up with their story.
Very good. Very good.
Thank you so much, Amishji, for that.
Thank you.
So I open the floor for questions now. I think Sanchi has a question. Come forward.
Yes. Hi, Sanchi.
Sanchi, you may need to unmute yourself if you have muted.
Sorry.
Yes, Sanchi. Hi.
Okay. Hello, sir. Sir, I have a very general question for you. I want to know that when history about such unsung warriors like Suheldev, it is compiled into a book for which we have very limited reference literature, how do we judge the authenticity of the text we are referring to? Like, how do we identify the text which is maybe biasedly written as our textbooks today, and how do we know that this text is reliable? How do you decide?
I'm not a scholar. I'm a storyteller. So scholars like Sanjeev Sanyal or Vikram Sampath or Abhinav Prakash or Hindol Gupta will probably be able to answer this question better. But I read a lot. I read at least 5-6 books per month, and I read mainly non-fiction. So understand that my answer is from that perspective. I'm not a scholar. I'm only a storyteller. One of the key things that that scholars, because the job of scholars is to study primary sources, right? And evaluate the credibility of those primary sources, and triangulate information from multiple competing primary sources, right? Because every primary source has its own bias. To assume that any book will have no bias is silly. Every book will have a bias, right? Like for example, my books have a bias of being a very proud Indian, right? But I don't try and hide it. I'm a very proud Indian. So obviously it will have a bias. Uh, some people may like that bias, but I don't know. Maybe someone in Pakistan may not like my bias, right? But if we are human beings, obviously we'll have a bias. It's a given, right? We are informed by our culture and by our upbringing. So a scholar's job is to step away from that and try and find competing sources and triangulate and get an information. A storyteller's job is not trying to make a scholarly thesis. A storyteller's job is to write a good story to convey some philosophies, right? It's not a scholar's job to convey philosophies. A scholar's job is to write a thesis of what could have most probably happened. Storyteller's job is through the wrapper of a story convey some philosophy, in which case, put in his or her own imagination into the story as well, where there are gaps, right? So there are two different jobs, so they require two different attitudes. One thing though that scholars in the West have started doing, which Indian scholars are yet to do. There was a time when texts were privileged over folk traditions, right? It was never the case in India in ancient times. There's a lovely Sanskrit line, Shastra Trudir Valyasi, that folk traditions are more important than texts. It's the Indian attitude. We wrote a lot of texts. I was just saying we had 3 million Sanskrit manuscripts. So it's not that we didn't write, but our ancestors used to give a lot of respect to folk traditions and folk memory as well. Okay. The Westerners and the Middle Easterners privileged text over folk traditions, right? And that attitude reflected in their history books as well. And the British Raj had that attitude, okay? And our establishment historians picked up that attitude from the British, okay? And they continue with that attitude right now. Western scholars have changed their attitude. They have realized that texts are written by the victors, so obviously they'll have a very obvious bias. And then there is no storytellers of those who were not victors, right? So they realize, and the stories of those who were defeated is remembered in folk traditions often, right? So Western historians have now started giving respect to folk traditions and stories as well, not just texts. You realize the impact of this. I'm in the UK. So the first king of the Anglo-Saxons, King Alfred, okay, or his successor, Edward the Elder, they were the people who, quote unquote, created England, the culture of England, right? There are very few texts on them. Much of it is actually folk traditions. But modern Western scholars are willing to accept folk traditions to write a history book, right? Whereas Indian establishment scholars give no respect to folk traditions. They only privilege texts. The text will obviously support the Turkic invaders or the British invaders. They will not support, especially subaltern rulers who, texts aren't available. So King Suhail Dev, his stories are more folk traditions, okay, and evidence is left behind by that. So scholars should study that as well, not just texts. They need to study folk stories and folk traditions as well. The West has realized it. Indian scholars learned the bad habits of the West during the colonial era and have yet to unlearn it. We need to go back to our ancient way, where we studied texts and folk traditions.
Thank you, sir.
Next should be Pratik. Pratik had a question.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, Pratik, very audible. Tell me.
Yeah, namaste, sir.
Namaste.
Today we used to talk about our ancient history and the great wisdom, and we are proud about that science and lifestyle, about our ancestors. But many times people make joke of that at one point that we had such a great knowledge, though we have lost many of the literature, but still we give examples of many scientific methods. But when something of the modern science is invented, after that we quote that invention from our ancient text. So why aren't we applying it with the modern science for the future discoveries? And what are the reason behind that? That our ancient science is not so popular nowadays. though we are, making our effort, but how one can work with this ancient science in parallel with this modern one? Thank you.
Pratik, very good question. And the reason for this ignorance and biases is the lack of knowledge. We don't study anything about our ancient sciences. I find more studies about ancient Indian sciences in the UK than in India. You know, there are more Sanskrit departments in the West than in India. It's easier to study Arabic in India than Sanskrit in our university departments. So a lot of it is our own biases. We are not trying to study our own ancestors. And then at times fantasies will prosper, which people make fun of, like some people saying that we had traveled to Mars. There's no evidence of that, right? But the fact that surgery was there in ancient India is a fact. Okay, it is there in our texts. Okay, the fact that Bodhayana Ji discovered Pythagoras theorem before Pythagoras did is a fact. Okay, it is there in our texts. The fact that Vastu Shastra is a very, very scientific architecture system. It's not just about some superstitions about where to put your door. That is nonsense that is told to us. It's a very scientific architecture system, but it's not taught to us because our architecture schools desperately want to learn only Western stuff. We don't learn anything of our own medicine, of our own mathematics, of our own navigation techniques, of our own irrigation techniques, of our own metallurgy techniques. Damascus steel was actually imported from India, the technique of Damascus steel, but we don't learn this, and because we don't actually, there was an exhibition in the UK some 3 years back, a 5,000-year history of Indian sciences. Okay, I mean, I wasn't there when the exhibition was done, but I've seen pictures of it. Such a beautiful research, such a beautiful job done by Goras, by British out here. But ऐसा exhibition हम लोग इंडिया में launch करेंगे तो they'll say, हाँ ये क्या बकवास है, why are you doing this? So we must study our own sciences. We might find knowledge out there which can be useful today, even in today's day. Like, my favorite example, because of our obsession in architecture, because of our obsession with trying to be Western, you will notice all our cities have glass wall buildings. Have you noticed that? Many of our cities, offices, जो नए जो बने हैं वो कांच के दीवार बना देते हैं. Correct, no?
Yeah.
Where the architecture technique of these glass wall buildings, they emerged in the US, in the Northeast coast, and in Europe. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, in these countries, a glass wall building makes a lot of sense because these countries have a shortage of the sun. Most of the expenditures on heating bills. If you build a glass wall building, okay, your lighting cost comes down. Second, the sun rays refract in, so it's hot inside. So you don't have to spend money on heating bill. India, is there a shortage of heat? Is there a shortage of sun? No, right? So we build a big glass wall building. What we are essentially building in India is a giant microwave oven. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
A giant microwave oven. So because of that, you'll find that I used to work in a bank, for example. Okay. My last job as a member of the senior management committee, which means I had a cabin with a glass wall. So ye side se sala, the sun is baking me. Okay. And it's a glass wall building and people realize it's too hot. So under say AC is blasting. Okay. And so ye side say heat, ye side say cold. Every sala, third, fourth week I would fall ill. Why are we building glass wall buildings when it has no connection to the Indian climate? It has a connection to the European climate. Why? Because our architects are desperate to be Western. They don't want to learn Vastu Shastra, which is the Indian way. There's a logic to having a central courtyard. All our ancient buildings used to have a central courtyard. Why did we have that? One of the key things our ancestors said, in the Indian atmosphere, having wind circulation, air circulation is critical because we have a hot and humid atmosphere. Okay, in most of our coastal areas, and even in the drier parts up north, again, wind circulation cools the house down, right? It gets fresh air. You will not build that in UK because the air is so cold. If you have wind circulation, you will fall ill. But in India, you can build it. So this is a part of our Vastu Shastra. लेकिन हमको कुछ सिखाना नहीं है. हमको तो Western बनना है. किसी भी तरह साला अंग्रेज बन जाओ. Okay. How do we teach our sciences in our education system? There's a critical reform. I have written various articles on this. This is one of the things I keep speaking of. Our government has to do this. We have to Indianize our education system. Then when we have knowledge of our sciences, we will realize what we can learn And things that we should question, of course we should question. There are good things to learn from the West also. I'm not anti-West, but we should be balanced. We have to learn our own traditions, our own scientific traditions, and we should learn from the West as well and find a modern balance. That's what I think.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Next question, Sai, how much more time do we have to do this? Because I have another interview. Nathu, that person will start calling me again and again. Sai, I can't hear you.
Sir, it's Om
Yeah.
Priyadarshi.
Just two more questions, one from
Okay.
Shashank and one from Om,
Done.
I guess. Om, can you move on?
Sir, my question is on your book Sita, the warrior of Mithila. So the question is, mostly times Sita ji has been portrayed as an ideal daughter, a perfect wife, exemplary mother with very much empathy, humility, and sensitivity. In her text, in mostly text, stories, illustrations, movies, and modern media. So, don't you feel your way of narrating Sita ji as a warrior is something that distorts the original image of Sita? Like, don't it become more fictional in this data-centric era?
Okay, good question. Yeah, good question, Om. So before I answer, I have a counter question for you. The Lakshman Rekha. You heard of the Lakshman Rekha?
Yes, sir.
Is it there in the Ramayana?
Yeah, as per text, I am not read the actual Ramayana.
So Lakshman Rekha, the way modern Indians see it, with Lakshmanji taking that arrow and drawing that line, that was there in Ramanand Sagarji's 1980s television serial. Okay. That is not the way it is described in any of the texts, at least not the ones that I have read.
Okay.
In the original Valmiki Ramayana, Lakshman Rekha is not even mentioned. There is no Lakshman Rekha in the original Valmiki Ramayana. The only time, at least from the ones that I have read, where Lakshman Rekha is mentioned is in Goswami Tulsidas Ji's Ramcharitmanas. There also, it is not described the way we saw it in the television serial. There, the Lakshman Rekha is spoken of briefly, if I am not mistaken, I think in the Lanka Kand, when Mandodari ji is speaking to Ravana. Okay. At that time, it is mentioned. Okay.
Okay.
This is just to give you one example that there are many interpretations, and those that we think is there is actually not there in the original Ramayana. Lakshman Rekha is not there in the original Maharishi Valmiki ji's Ramayana. It's not there. Okay, Lakshman Rekha is not mentioned. This is just one example. There are many examples like this. There is a version of the Ramayana called the Adbhut Ramayana. Okay? There are 3 Ramayans that are credited to Maharishi Valmiki ji. Okay? One is, of course, the original Valmiki Ramayana. The second is the Adbhut Ramayana, and the third is the Ananda Ramayana. These 3 Ramayans are credited to Valmiki ji. The Ananda Ramayana, for example, has a great battle at the beginning, close to the sea. A great battle between Ravan and Lord Dashrath, by the way. Okay, I was inspired by that, which you have put in Ram Sign of Ikshvaku, but it's actually from the Ananda Ramayana, which was credited to Valmiki ji. In the Adbhut Ramayana, also credited to Valmiki ji, there are 2 Ravans. Okay, one is the younger Ravan, the other is the elder Ravan. The elder Ravan is not killed by Lord Ram in that version of the Ramayana, in Adbhut Ramayana. The elder Ravan is killed by Sita Ma, by Devi Sita. Okay.
Yes.
And like I said, credited to Valmiki ji, Adbhut Ramayana, very ancient. Okay. So in that, she's fierce and strong in that version. There's a wonderful couplet in the Adbhut Ramayana. I'm sure you've heard the Mahabharat couplet, Yada Yada Dharmasya. You heard the one, no? Glanir Bhavati Bharata. Yeah, where Lord Krishna tells Arjun. There's a version of this line in the Adbhut Ramayana. Yada Yada Dharmasya Glanir Bhavati Suvrata. It's a different one. Glanir Bhavati Suvrata Abhyuthanam Adharmasya Tada Prakruti Sambhava. Okay? This from the Adbhut Ramayana. What it means, what it translates as is, remember, O keeper of righteous vows, whenever adharma rises or whenever dharma is in decline, the sacred feminine will incarnate. Ma Prakruti will incarnate. She will defend dharma. She will protect us. Okay. So, and this is, like I said, Adbhut Ramayana, credited to Valmiki ji. One of the beauties of the Indian way is that there are so many truths. There's this lovely line in the Rig Veda, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. Truth is one, but the wise speak it as many. And there are so many truths, and we love and respect every truth, because all those truths give us a different facet of the land that we are so attached to, our Mother India. Yeah. So I've drawn inspiration from there.
Thanks a lot, Amishji. It was lovely listening to all the versions of Ramayana. I think the last question would be from Shashank.
Yeah, hi Jajan. Tell me.
Hello, sir. I really like the emphasis you put on recognizing our folk traditions while writing the history. My question actually is, your writings are like retelling of a civilizational journey of India. So, as an author and as a voracious reader like you, you develop a very keen eye for societal undercurrents and societal behavior. So, what do you think that future has in store for a country like India and for its youth?
A damn good question, Shashank. I'm an India optimist, not just because I'm a patriot. Okay, I think the trajectory is such. India is a bottom-up country, and truly India cometh the hour, cometh the man. The leader comes at the right time. When we need such a leader rises. Right? There was a time, for 1,000 or 1,200 years, where you almost felt like the gods were against us. Just when things were going right, something terrible would happen to push us back. Think of the great general who is derisively referred to as Hemu. His actual name was Hemchandra, right? King Hemchandra. Hemu, I guess, is a way to kind of, maybe as a name, kind of reduce his status a bit. His name was King Hemchandra. Brilliant warrior. He probably would have won the Battle of Panipat as well. Stray arrow hits him in the eye, and the battle is lost. Right? The Gurjar Pratihara battles against Muhammad Ghori, again, just misfortune. Right? Muhammad Ghori, the actual battles that truly mattered were the ones with the Gurjar Pratiharas. Okay? Or the Kakadia loss to Malik Kafur. Malik Kafur himself, have you ever thought of his name, Kafur? Why is this? Kafur is actually as a version of Kafir. Okay? Malik Kafur was a Hindu who converted. And he's the second greatest temple destroyer after Aurangzeb. The one who destroyed the most number of temples. Why did that happen? So it's almost like the third battle of Panipat, the Marathas should have won, right? Infighting and misfortune, bad luck. So it was almost like the gods were against us. Today one feels that no, the gods are with us. That when fate has to support us, instead of hurting us, fate actually supports us. So one, there is a bottom-up momentum. That's 1.3 billion people with their Shakti, with their energy, fighting their way up. Leadership coming at the right time, right? And almost like the gods have decided that Mother India has suffered enough. Now we need to set things right. The key question for me is not that. I think if all of us keep working hard, if all of us remain united, if we don't give in to our usual tactic of infighting, which I am afraid of even now, we will rise. Okay? But the key question in my mind is not that. The key question is, when we become a superpower, what kind of superpower will we be? Will we be like the way our ancestors were? Or will we be like the superpowers of the recent past? Will we embarrass our ancestors, or will we make them proud? Our ancestors influenced most of the world through the first millennium common era. You read the works of Angus Madison, we controlled 1/3 of the world's GDP. Even the US today doesn't control that much, controls around 20%, right? More than 50% of the world were influenced by our culture. Our soft power spread far and wide. We didn't send any armies. Southeast Asian countries, except for one invasion by Rajendra Chola, Emperor Rajendra Chola, we never sent an invading army. And yet Southeast Asia restructured their own society, complete society, to become Indianized. They took on Hindu names, they built Hindu-style temples. China, Japan took on Buddhism. Central Asia became completely Buddhist. Mithraism went from here to Rome. It was very popular among the Roman soldiers. We didn't send any armies, but we influenced so much of the world. Why? Because our ancestors were tough but liberal. We weren't the California kind of liberal, which is weak and liberal. We were the New York kind of liberal, liberal but tough, right? We would never send armies to conquer other lands, but कोई भी यहाँ पे आता था साले को मार के भगा देते. We were a land which used to beat back every single invader. We were tough, we were successful, we were knowledge obsessed, we were wealthy, and we were a force for good. Can we be that kind of superpower in 10 years? To me, that is the critical conversation. And for that, our society, our youth need to speak about what kind of country do we want to be. Don't take it for granted that we'll become a superpower. We still have to work very hard, but it seems like the gods are with us. Okay, we still have to work very hard. Most importantly, we have to be united. But what we should also start thinking of, what kind of country do we want to be when we are a superpower? That is a critical conversation. Okay.
That was really, really insightful. We never noticed how time flew by, Amish. Thank you so much. I think we would love to keep talking with you. As you said, I think someone is waiting.
Yeah. So I better go because otherwise I'll start getting harassed. But absolute pleasure chatting with you, and Sai, always a pleasure speaking to you. Sachi, Shashank, Pratik, Om, thank you so much. Thank you so much, guys, and please take care. Jai Maa Bharati. Jai Suhel, Jai Maa Bharati.
Jai Maa Bharati, Jai Suhel.
Jai Maa Bharati.
Bye.